at 10:04 p.m., with a major rainstorm closing in and thousands of acres on the line, Tom's primary John Deere tractor came to a dead halt. Most dealers would let the phone ring to voicemail until morning. But what his dealer did at midnight didn't just save his harvest. It redefined what a real handshake promise actually means. The purchase of a primary field tractor is never a small matter on a multi-thousand-acre operation, and Tom Bradley had approached the acquisition of his John Deere 8 R410 with the same deliberate caution that had guided his 40 years of farming in Shelby County, Iowa. He was 64 years old, a man whose hands were mapped with the light scars of mechanical work, and whose opinions were formed slowly through observation rather than sales literature. When he signed the purchase agreement at Vance Equipment Company in Harlan 3 autumns ago, he had not been swept up by the high-horsepower figures, the upgraded cabin suspensions, or the refined diagnostic displays. He evaluated machinery by its frame strength, its fuel efficiency under sustained load, and the quality of the people standing behind the warranty. Artie Vance, the dealership principal, who had spent 15 years turning wrenches in service bays before taking over the franchise, understood how men like Tom operated. As Tom laid down the pen, Artie took a plain white business card from his desk drawer, unscrewed the cap of a heavy black fountain pen, and turned the card over. He did not write the dealership's main service line or the after-hours voicemail extension. In bold, clear numbers, he wrote his personal cell phone digits across the back. Artie looked Tom in the eye as he handed the card across the desk. He told Tom directly that if a mechanical issue ever threatened to shut down his operation during the pressure of harvest, Tom was to call that exact number first, day or night, weekend or midnight. Artie added that a breakdown in the middle of a short weather window was not an inconvenience to be handled on Monday morning. It was a crisis that demanded an immediate answer. Tom did not rely on loose business cards that could be misplaced in a crowded truck cab. Instead, he opened the worn leather-bound notebook he carried in his shirt pocket, the same black ink ledger system he had maintained since 1986 to track fuel consumption, fluid changes, field yields, and structural repairs. On the inside back cover, right below the serial numbers for his implements, Tom transcribed Artie's personal number in crisp, methodical handwriting. Next to the 10 digits, he noted the exact date and the spoken promise Artie had made. For 2 full harvest seasons, that ink entry remained untested. The John Deere 8 R410 operated with absolute precision through 2 full cycles of spring tillage, summer field work, and autumn hauling across Tom's 2,200 acres of corn and soybeans. It accumulated operating hours quietly and without drama, operating well within its rated capacity under the care of a farmer who maintained his equipment strictly by the book. Tom never had a reason to make the call, but he never forgot the number was written there. The third week of October brought the kind of crisp, dry Midwestern autumn air that every corn producer in Shelby County prayed for during harvest. For 4 consecutive days, Tom Bradley had kept his operation moving at a steady, relentless pace across his largest continuous block of ground, an 800-acre section of high-yielding corn along the county line. The crop was dry, standing clean, and coming off the cob at 18% moisture, which meant minimal drying costs at the local elevator. But the evening weather report had changed the equation completely. A major cold front moving out of the plains was tracking directly toward western Iowa, carrying a 90% chance of heavy, sustained rainfall predicted to hit within 72 hours. Once that water landed, the heavy black soil on the North 40 would turn to thick mud, shutting down field operations for a week or more and risking severe stalk rut if high winds accompanied the storm. Tom was running his John Deere 8 R410 on primary grain cart duty, shuttling 50-bushel loads back and forth between the combine at the center of the field and the waiting semi-trucks parked on the gravel road. It was demanding work that required smooth throttle control and constant hydraulic engagement as the cart pulled up alongside the moving combine's unload auger. By 10 o'clock on Wednesday night, the air temperature had dropped to 42 degrees, and the darkness outside the cab was cut only by the bright LED field lights mounted on the John Deere's roof and front grille. Inside the quiet, climate-controlled cab, Tom monitored the digital gauges with practiced eyes, keeping a steady rhythm that he and his hired hand had maintained for 14 continuous hours. At precisely 10:04 p.m., the steady rhythm broke. As Tom slowed the tractor to align the grain cart beneath the combine chute, he felt a subtle, sickening change through the steering wheel. The fluid, effortless power steering suddenly grew stiff and heavy, requiring real physical effort to turn the front tires across the field ruts. Almost simultaneously, a sharp amber warning light flashed on the right-hand corner post display panel, accompanied by an audible warning chime indicating a rapid pressure drop in the main auxiliary hydraulic loop. Tom did not attempt to force the steering or throttle up to override the alarm. A veteran operator knows that mechanical warnings are not suggestions, and forcing a pressurized system under load only turns a minor failure into a catastrophic one. He immediately pulled the throttle back, disengaged the PTO, swung the tractor safely clear of the combine's path, and brought the heavy machine to a complete stop. Tom shut down the 8R410's engine, killing the low hum of the diesel power plant and leaving only the quiet tick of cooling metal in the October night. He set the parking brake, reached for the heavy flashlights stored behind the operator's seat, and pushed open the cab door. The cool night air hit him instantly, smelling of dry corn dust and damp earth. Stepping down the tractor's ladder, Tom felt the immediate change in environment. The quiet stillness of the field stood in stark contrast to the urgent pressure of the 72-hour weather forecast hanging over his head. He moved methodically around the front tire, keeping his flashlight beam aimed low to check the ground before examining the mechanical housing. Bright red hydraulic fluid glistened on the dark dirt beneath the tractor's rear hitch area. The puddle was fresh, spreading slowly through the soil, which confirmed that the system had lost pressure rapidly while under load. Tom raised the light beam, tracing the damp trail of oil up the frame, past the high-capacity rear three-point linkage, and directly toward the bank of selective control valves, where the grain cart's heavy hydraulic supply lines plugged into the tractor's rear quick-connect couplers. Approaching the coupling bank, Tom ducked under the tongue of the grain cart to get a closer look. The primary pressure line leading to the cart's folding auger mechanism showed clear signs of severe stress. The reinforced rubber hose itself was entirely intact, with no sign of bulging or outer sleeve abrasion. However, right at the crimped steel fitting, where the hose joined the male quick connect coupler, the metal collar had fractured cleanly along a stress seam. High-duty cycle operation, combined with the constant twisting forces of pulling a heavy cart across uneven terrain, had fatigued the metal until the pressurized fitting gave way under load. It was a classic field failure. It was not a blown hydraulic pump, an internal transmission seal blowout, or a complex electronic module malfunction that would take days to diagnose in a main dealership service shop. It was a straightforward high-pressure line fitting failure. Yet, despite its mechanical simplicity, the result was absolute. Without that hydraulic loop operational, the grain cart could not fold its auger or operate its gates, completely halting the harvest flow on the North 40 at a time when every hour was critical. Tom climbed back into the quiet cab of the 8R410, closing the door against the sharpening cold. The combine operator had pulled up alongside, idling his engine and looking across the short gap with an unasked question in his eyes. Tom signaled with a flat palm, telling him to hold position, then reached into his top shirt pocket. He pulled out the worn leather logbook, turned to the inside back cover under the overhead dome light, and looked at the handwritten 10-digit phone number he had transcribed 3 years ago. The clock on the tractor's digital dashboard read 10:12 p.m. For a man of Tom's generation, placing a call to a dealer principal's personal phone past 10 o'clock at night was not a casual act. It ran counter to decades of self-reliance, of fixing what could be fixed with what was in the shop and waiting out the rest until normal business hours on Monday morning. But the heavy cloud bank predicted for Saturday morning was real. The acres remaining were extensive, and the promise written on the back of Artie Vance's card had been given, without reservation. Tom dialed the digits, pressed the phone to his ear, and listened to the tone echo across the network. The call did not go to an automated answering service or a pre-recorded voicemail system. On the third ring, the line clicked open. Artie Vance's voice came through clear and alert, entirely free of the groggy tone of a man caught off guard. He answered with his own name and waited. Tom did not waste time with conversational openings or apology for the late hour. He identified himself, gave his exact position on the North 40 of his Shelby County acreage, and laid out the situation in the clear, deliberate language of a man who understood his machinery. He told Artie that the 8R410 had dropped hydraulic auxiliary pressure at 10:04 p.m. He specified that the issue was localized at the rear quick connect coupler on the second selective control valve, where the high-pressure fitting crimp on the main grain cart line had sheared cleanly under fatigue. He confirmed that the pump itself was sound, the reservoir had not run dry, and the machine was parked safely. Artie listened without interrupting, asking only for the exact fitting size and whether fluid was still leaking under static pressure. Tom provided both answers immediately. Artie paused for 2 seconds, told Tom he would have a service truck on site within 90 minutes, and hung up. Artie Vance set his cell phone down on the kitchen table, the quiet of his suburban Harlan home returning for a brief moment. At 52, Artie viewed the equipment business through a lens shaped by 15 years spent lying on cold concrete service bay floors and crawling under mud-caked frames in dark fields. He had worked his way up from an apprentice line mechanic to service manager before taking over the Vance Equipment franchise 14 years prior. That decade and a half on the wrenches had left him with permanent calluses on his palms and an uncompromising philosophy regarding dealer responsibility. A dealership that sold six-figure machinery but hid behind an answering machine during peak harvest was selling an illusion of partnership. To Artie, harvest was not a routine operating season. It was an annual sprint where a farmer's entire financial year was decided in a narrow window of daylight and favorable weather. A machine sitting idle in an October field because a $5 fitting failed at 10 o'clock at night was an operational failure that fell squarely on the dealer's shoulders if they chose convenience over service. To enforce this standard, Artie ran a strict on-call rotation throughout the 6 weeks of peak harvest, ensuring that a qualified field technician, a fully equipped service truck, and access to the parts warehouse were available around the clock. At 10:16 p.m., exactly 4 minutes after hanging up with Tom Bradley, Artie placed a second call. He dialed Ray Miller, his lead mobile service technician. Ray had been with Vance Equipment for 11 years, a veteran mechanic whose mechanical intuition and field competence had saved dozens of harvest runs across Shelby County. Ray answered on the first ring, a requirement for anyone holding the primary service phone during peak rotation. Artie did not mince words. He informed Ray that Tom Bradley's 8R410 was down on the North 40 with a sheared high-pressure hydraulic crimp fitting on the grain cart auxiliary line. He outlined the specific coupler size Tom had confirmed, noted that the main hydraulic pump was unaffected, and instructed Ray to meet him at the dealership's main shop in 20 minutes. Ray acknowledged the assignment without hesitation, confirming he would have his service truck warmed up and at the dealership lot by 10:35 p.m. Artie grabbed his jacket, picked up his truck keys, and headed out the door into the cool night air. Artie Vance's pickup pulled onto the gravel lot of Vance Equipment Company at precisely 10:33 p.m. The sprawling facility sat quiet along the highway bypass, its long brick facade illuminated only by security floodlights and the soft yellow glow of the main showroom windows. The rows of green and yellow row crop tractors, combines, and tillage implements parked out front stood like silent sentinels in the October frost. Artie parked near the side service entrance, unlocked the steel access door, and stepped into the darkened building, the familiar smell of diesel exhaust, shop floor sealant, and fresh hydraulic oil greeting him as the heavy door clicked shut behind him. He did not bother turning on the main, overhead, high bay lighting for the entire building. Instead, he flipped the low-wattage hallway switches and navigated the long concrete corridor, leading directly past the quiet service bays to the secured parts inventory room at the rear of the shop. A dealer principal who had spent 15 years working as a service mechanic knew the structural layout of his parts department down to the rack number and bin location. He did not need high noon daylight or an automated computer lookup to locate fast-moving wear items for high-horsepower utility machines. Unlocking the wire mesh gate of the parts storage area, Artie walked directly to Rack 14, Shelf C, the dedicated bin system for high-pressure hydraulic quick connect couplers heavy-duty line crimps, and O-ring face seal fittings used on the 8R tractor series. Reaching into the labeled storage bin, he pulled the heavy steel mail fitting assembly that matched the exact specifications of Tom Bradley's grain cart supply line. The solid metal piece felt cool and dense in his palm. Artie did not stop at pulling the single failed component. Experience in the field had taught him that high cycle fatigue rarely affects just one fitting in isolation. Adjacent lines on the same hydraulic manifold often endure identical vibration stress and pressure spikes over hundreds of operating hours. He reached back into the adjacent bins and pulled 2 secondary female couplers and a pair of high-temp O-ring replacement kits. He tossed the extra components into a heavy canvas service bag, zipped it shut, and walked back toward the loading bay just as the headlights of Ray Miller's service truck swept across the darkened shop floor. Ray Miller's heavy-duty Ford F-550 service truck pulled to a halt right beside the loading bay doors at 10:52 p.m., its diesel engine idling with a deep, steady rumble. The bed was outfitted with a high-capacity crane, onboard air compressor, hydraulic hose crimper, and drawers filled with specialized field tools. Ray stepped out into the crisp night air, pulling his heavy work gloves from his coat pocket. Artie pushed open the double steel doors, carrying the heavy canvas service bag into the bright beam of the truck's rear work lights. Without a word of wasted greeting, the 2 men met at the dropped tailgate of the service truck. Artie unzipped the canvas bag and laid the shiny, steel hydraulic components out across the weathered metal tailgate surface. Ray unclipped a heavy, oil-stained John Deere service reference binder from the cab door, turning quickly to the hydraulic system assembly diagrams for the 8R series. Under the white glare of the truck's exterior LED floodlights, they conducted a precise, item-by-item verification. Ray picked up the primary male quick connect fitting, rotating it between his fingers to inspect the machining threads and the internal rubber seal seat. He cross-referenced the part number stamped into the hex collar against the specific serial number range listed in the manual for Tom's specific production year. Everything aligned perfectly. The thread pitch, the pressure tolerance rating, and the fluid flow specifications matched the high-demand requirements of a heavy grain cart setup. Artie then handed over the 2 extra adjacent fittings and the O-ring kits he had pulled from the back shelves. Ray nodded in silent approval as he packed the components into his primary field carry case. A technician who had spent over a decade servicing machinery in muddy pastures and dark fields understood the value of carrying the adjacent parts on the first trip. Driving 20 miles back to the shop for a second $5 seal was an amateur mistake that cost valuable harvest hours. Satisfied that they had every tool, hose section, and fitting required for the job, Ray closed the service truck tailgate, climbed back into the cab, and put the heavy truck into gear. At 11:02 p.m., the service truck rolled out of the dealership lot, heading north toward Tom Bradley's field. Out on the North 40, the vast silence of the Iowa night settled heavily over the dark cornfield. The combine operator had shut down his threshing rotor, reducing the massive harvester to a low idle a few hundred yards away, while the grain cart driver stepped down from his secondary rig to check in. Tom met him at the hitch, his voice calm and unhurried as he explained the hydraulic fitting failure. He instructed the younger man to turn off his engine, head to his pickup, and get 40 minutes of rest. Frantic pacing and anxious conversation would not make the service truck drive any faster, and a tired crew made costly mistakes when the work resumed. Once his driver was resting, Tom retrieved a portable mechanical pressure gauge and a clean rag from the toolbox mounted inside his truck bed. He returned to the dark frame of the John Deere 8R410, using his flashlight to check the hydraulic fluid sight glass on the rear housing. The fluid level had dropped past the top indicator mark due to the sudden line break, but it remained comfortably above the critical minimum line. Connecting his manual test gauge to the diagnostic port on the valve block, he confirmed that static system pressure had completely stabilized the moment he killed the engine, meaning no internal check valves had been compromised. With his technical check complete, Tom climbed back into the warm cab of the 8R410. He pulled the leather logbook from his shirt pocket, unscrewed his pen, and began recording the exact sequence of events under the cab's soft interior lights. In neat, steady handwriting, He logged the precise time the pressure drop occurred, 10:04 p.m., followed by his physical inspection findings, the fluid loss estimate, and the exact timestamp of his phone call to Artie Vance at 10:12 p.m. He noted the weather conditions, the 42-degree ambient temperature, and the remaining acreage on the north section. For Tom, documenting these operational facts was not an act of frustration. It was a matter of professional discipline. When a machine stopped moving during a critical 72-hour harvest window, maintaining an accurate ledger kept a man grounded in reality rather than speculation. He capped his pen, slid the notebook back into his shirt pocket, and turned his eyes toward the dark dirt access road at the edge of the property, watching the horizon for incoming headlights. At 11:38 p.m., two sharp beams of light cut through the tree-line at the south corner of the section. The heavy tires of Ray Miller's service truck crunched over the dry corn stubble as the rig maneuvered past the field gate, its yellow roof strobe flashing softly against the dark expanse of the North 40. Tom Bradley stepped out of his tractor cab, descending a ladder to meet the truck as it rolled to a smooth stop 20 feet from the disabled John Deere 8 R410. The arrival was right on schedule, 1 hour and 26 minutes after Tom had placed his initial call to Artie Vance. Ray stepped out of the cab without rushing, nodding in quiet greeting to Tom. The two men had known each other for over a decade, built on a foundation of mutual professional respect. Ray did not waste time with small talk. He immediately reached for the truck's external lighting controls, activating a boom-mounted LED work light array that flooded the rear assembly of the 8 R410 in bright, shadowless white light. The dark Iowa field was instantly transformed into a clean, well-lit fieldwork bay. Ray unlatched his heavy steel tool tote and walked directly to the rear hitch assembly, where the hydraulic fluid glinted under the lights. He dropped to one knee on a heavy rubber work mat, positioning his inspection beam directly onto the selective control valve manifold. Using a clean shop rag, he wiped away the excess oil surrounding the secondary control valve port and closely examined the sheared fitting. He took the metal collar between his fingers, checking the brake pattern under magnification. Ray looked up at Tom and confirmed the diagnosis: a clean fatigue fracture at the crimp collar caused by high cycle stress from the heavy grain cart hitch, exactly as Tom had described over the phone. With the diagnosis verified and no secondary structural damage found on the valve housing threads, Ray laid out his specialized tools on a clean canvas fender cover. He organized his metric flare nut wrenches, high-torque line sockets, line plugs, and the portable hydraulic hose crimper. Everything was placed in order of use, clean and ready. Ray looked up at Tom, pulled his gloves tight, and stated calmly that he would have the fitting replaced, the lines bled, and the machine ready for operation in under 45 minutes. Ray went to work with the steady, unhurried efficiency of a veteran mechanic, using two-line wrenches to prevent torque transfer to the delicate valve manifold. He backed off the damaged fitting stem, caught the small amount of remaining fluid in a catch basin, and plugged the open port to prevent dirt from contaminating the hydraulic oil. He prepped the end of the heavy flexible hose, set the new steel fitting collar into place, and clamped his portable hydraulic crimper over the assembly. The pump motor hummed as the dies squeezed the collar to its exact factory diameter, forming a tight, leak-free bond. Within 20 minutes, the primary broken line was fully restored and reconnected to the selective control valve coupler. But as Ray wiped down the surrounding manifold to check his work, his flashlight beam caught a subtle anomaly on the adjacent return hose assembly. He leaned in closer, scraping away a thin layer of grime with his fingernail to inspect the steel crimp on the secondary line. Right where the metal met the rubber casing, microfractures were visible under the bright LED light, the early, telltale signs of stress fatigue that matched the failure pattern of the first fitting. Ray did not ignore those microfractures simply because they had not yet let go. He knew that under another 12 hours of heavy load, pulling a fully loaded grain cart across rough field ruts, that second fitting would inevitably shear, bringing Tom's operation to a dead halt all over again during the coming rainstorm. Reaching into his service tote, Ray pulled out one of the secondary fittings Artie had insisted on packing back at the shop. Without a word of hesitation, Ray unbolted the worn secondary line, trimmed the fatigued end of the hose, crimped the fresh steel collar onto the rubber, and torqued the assembly back onto the valve block. Tom stood nearby, watching the technician perform the unrequested secondary repair under the bright floodlights. He recognized the rare quality of a man who does not merely patch the breakdown that brought him to the field, but eliminates the breakdown waiting down the road. Ray torqued the final lock nut to specification, wiped the entire manifold clean with solvent, and picked up his wrenches. Ray pulled his clean shop rag across the newly installed fittings one final time, making sure no trace of solvent or residual oil remained on the valve manifold. He packed his wrenches, hydraulic crimper, and catch basin into the side compartments of the service truck, closing the heavy steel doors with a firm latch. Looking at his watch, Ray turned to Tom and signaled that it was time to pressurize the system. The repair, including the unrequested secondary replacement, had taken precisely 40 minutes from the moment Ray set down his tool tote on the Iowa dirt. Tom ascended the ladder of the John Deere 8 R410, settling into the air ride seat and pulling the cab doors shut against the late-night chill. He turned the ignition key, allowing the engine heaters to cycle before bringing the heavy diesel engine to life. The motor turned over smoothly, settling into a steady, deep idle that vibrated gently through the floorboards. Tom let the machine warm up for 2 minutes, letting the hydraulic fluid circulate through the filter housing, before reaching for the selective control valve levers on the right-hand command arm console. He engaged the primary auxiliary loop, sending pressurized oil through the newly crimped fitting directly to the grain cart's heavy hydraulic system. Down on the ground, Ray stood clear, his flashlight beam trained steadily on the valve block, watching for the slightest sign of weeping fluid or pressure flange movement. Inside the cab, Tom watched the corner post digital display screen. The auxiliary system bar graph climbed rapidly, holding solid at its full operational benchmark of nearly 3,000 pounds per square inch without the slightest flicker or pressure sag. Tom shifted the 8 R410 into gear and eased the throttle forward, turning the heavy front tires across the dry corn stubble to test the power steering. The steering wheel turned with fluid, effortless precision, completely restored from the stiff, heavy resistance he had felt hours earlier. He cycled the grain cart's folding auger mechanism out and back in, verifying that the hydraulic response was crisp and immediate. Everything functioned exactly as it had when the machine first rolled off the factory floor. Tom shut down the engine, stepped out, and shook Ray's hand under the floodlights, noting the clock on his dashboard. It was exactly 1:18 a.m. The total operational downtime stood at 3 hours and 14 minutes. A small delay in a 72-hour weather window that could have easily become a multi-day disaster. With the John Deere 8 R410 running cleanly and its hydraulic pressure holding steady under load, Tom Bradley resumed field operations immediately after Ray Miller's service truck pulled off the North 40. Throughout the remaining hours of the night and into the first gray light of dawn, the tractor operated without a single hitch. The combine unloaded continuously into the grain cart. The semis hauled load after load to the county grain elevator, and by Friday afternoon, a full 18 hours before the predicted storm front crossed the Missouri River, Tom's final 800 acres of corn were harvested, dried, and safely stored in the bins. On Saturday morning, as the heavy cloud bank rolled in and a steady, cold rain began to fall across Shelby County, Tom stood inside his dry, heated workshop, looking out the window at his clean, parked equipment. The work was finished, but Tom's discipline required one final task before he called the season complete. He walked over to his workbench, pulled his leather-bound logbook from his shirt pocket, and uncapped his black fountain pen. Sitting at his desk under the bright shop lights, he opened the book to the section dedicated to the 8 R410's operational record. In precise, unhurried handwriting, Tom documented the entire sequence of events from Wednesday night with total clarity. He recorded the exact moment of hydraulic line failure, 10:04 p.m. on October 19th. He noted the time he dialed Artie Vance's personal number, 10:12 p.m., and Artie's immediate professional response. He wrote down the arrival time of service technician Ray Miller, 11:38 p.m., and detailed the specific repairs performed under the field lights. He recorded the primary male quick connect coupler replacement, the secondary return line fitting crimp that Ray had proactively performed without being asked, and the exact completion time of 1:18 a.m. Finally, he calculated and recorded the total operational downtime, 3 hours and 14 minutes. He noted the ambient temperature, the pending rain forecast, and the fact that the entire harvest had been completed on schedule despite the midnight breakdown. There were no emotional exaggerations or dramatic flourishes in his entries. Only facts, timestamps, part numbers, and measured results. Tom capped his pen, closed the worn leather ledger, and placed it back on the wooden shelf above his workbench, nestled safely between the records of previous years. It was a permanent record of a promise kept when the pressure was highest. The late January wind blew cold across the flat, snow-covered landscape of Shelby County, driving a fine powder against the brick walls of the Iowa State Extension Office in Harlan. Inside the basement meeting room, 40 local farmers sat in folding chairs surrounding long wooden tables, shedding heavy winter coats and holding paper cups of hot coffee. The annual Winter Agronomy and Equipment Roundtable had been a staple of the local agricultural community since the late 1970s. It was a gathering that had survived the digital age simply because a room full of experienced operators talking face-to-face produced a clear, honest level of practical information that no internet forum or glossy sales brochure could ever replicate. Tom Bradley sat near the back of the room, listening quietly with his leather logbook tucked inside his coat pocket. He was not a man given to public speaking or unnecessary commentary, preferring to let others air their opinions while he observed. The scheduled presentation on soil fertility and seed selection had wrapped up early, and the open discussion period quickly pivoted to what was always a sore subject among heavy equipment operators: post-purchase dealer service, rising parts costs, and the frustrating reality of harvest breakdowns. The tone in the room quickly sharpened as individual frustration found a collective voice. A farmer from the eastern side of the county stood up to recount his autumn experience, describing how an electronic sensor fault on his combine had left him waiting 36 hours for a field technician who ultimately arrived without the necessary diagnostic software. Another operator, who farmed 2,200 acres near Defiance, described calling his dealer's designated emergency harvest line 3 separate times during an October weather window, only to be routed to an automated voicemail system that was not checked until 8 o'clock the following morning. A third farmer added that when a service truck finally arrived at his farm after a 2-day delay, the technician fixed only the immediate broken line, ignoring a second frayed hose that blew out 4 hours later. The room echoed with quiet nods and murmurs of agreement. These were men who managed million-dollar capital investments and faced narrow weather windows every autumn. Yet many felt that once the purchase agreement was signed, the dealer's commitment faded the moment the work shifted past 5 o'clock on a Friday evening. Tom Bradley waded through the chorus of complaints, letting the frustration in the room run its natural course until a lull fell over the meeting. He reached into his coat pocket, pulled out the worn leather logbook, and quietly raised his hand. The moderator acknowledged him immediately, and the room turned to look at the veteran farmer. Tom did not stand up, nor did he adopt the energetic tone of a man trying to convince anyone or sell a particular brand. He opened the ledger across his knee, turning directly to the entry dated October 19th. In a calm, measured voice, Tom spoke directly to the room. He stated that he was not presenting an opinion or making an advertisement for any dealership, but simply reading an operational log from his own harvest notebook. He gave the exact details of his midnight breakdown on the North 40. The 8 R410 losing auxiliary hydraulic pressure at 10:04 p.m. while pulling a fully loaded grain cart in front of a heavy rainstorm. He noted the exact time he called dealer Artie Vance's personal number, 10:12 p.m., and how Artie had answered on the third ring without hesitation. The room fell completely quiet as Tom read down the page, stating every recorded timestamp with deliberate clarity. He explained how Artie Vance had driven to his own dealership in Harlan at 10:35 p.m. to pull the required hydraulic fittings from the dark warehouse himself, meeting service technician Ray Miller to double-check the part numbers against the serial manual before dispatching the truck. Tom noted Ray's arrival at the field at 11:38 p.m., 1 hour and 26 minutes after the initial phone call, and described the bright LED lighting setup that turned the dark cornfield into a clean workspace. He then highlighted the detail that mattered most to every operator in that room: how Ray Miller had noticed microfractures on an adjacent secondary return hose and replaced it proactively without being asked, ensuring the machine would not break down a second time. Tom closed the entry by reading the final timestamp, 1:18 a.m., and the total downtime figure of 3 hours and 14 minutes. He laid the notebook flat on his knee and stated simply that in 40 years of farming, he had never seen a dealer response that matched what Artie Vance and Ray Miller delivered in the middle of an October night. The quiet that settled over the extension office basement was absolute. In a room filled with 40 pragmatic, cautious men who evaluated everything through the lens of cost per acre and seasonal yield, Tom Bradley's simple reading of his logbook carried far more weight than any polished marketing pitch or glossy sales brochure ever could. He looked around at the familiar faces, neighbors who had spent years fighting tight harvest windows, mechanical failures, and unpredictable Iowa weather, and offered his final, measured verdict on modern machinery ownership. Tom stated that every major manufacturer on the market today builds capable, high-horsepower machinery. The paint color, the horsepower ratings, and the fancy cab monitors all served their purpose in normal operating conditions. But when a heavy rain front is 72 hours away and a high-pressure line gives out on a Wednesday night, the true value of an equipment brand is not determined by the metal alone. It is determined entirely by the character of the people standing behind it. A green tractor, or any tractor for that matter, is only as good as the dealer who is willing to answer his personal phone at 10 o'clock at night and stand in a cold, muddy field to make things right. When the meeting adjourned, several high-acreage operators walked over to Tom's table, asking for the exact details of the service setup at Vance Equipment Company. Within weeks, those conversations translated into serious inquiries at the dealership in Harlan. Dennis Cole, who farmed over 3,000 acres to the north, visited Artie Vance's showroom the following month and, after asking direct questions about the harvest emergency rotation, signed a purchase agreement for 2 new row crop units. Artie Vance did not earn that business through aggressive sales tactics or discounted pricing. He earned it because a veteran farmer had written down the honest truth in black ink on a dark October night. At 1:18 a.m. on the North 40, with a fresh hydraulic fitting secured, a secondary where point eliminated, and a service truck rolling away into the dark, Tom Bradley had climbed back into his cab and put his machine to work, finishing his harvest safely before the rain arrived. True reliability is never about promises made in a warm showroom. It is about actions taken when the lights are off and the clock is ticking. If you appreciate these grounded, real-world stories of agricultural craftsmanship, mechanical problem-solving, and the quiet dedication that keeps our farms running, please take a brief moment to like this video, share it with someone who understands the value of hard work, and subscribe to the channel for more stories like this.